Hello, biology students. Welcome to Unit 2. In this unit, we're going to be talking about cells. As always, follow along with this notes video in your student notes, fill in any blanks, make any personal notes that you need to, and then you'll use those notes on all kinds of stuff ranging from a little quiz to papers to the big exam at the end, okay? So anyway, we're talking about cells. The first little section we're talking about is something called the cell theory. Now, the word theory is interesting because a theory is not proven or it's not total in its thought. And so the reason that we call it the cell theory is because everything that we know and understand about cells, yes, a lot of it, as you see, has been proven, but we keep that name because there's still a lot that we're looking to figure out. Hey, some of y'all may actually be people that add to this cell theory. So you'll see as we go through some scientists in the past, kind of how they progressed learning about the cells and new information kept getting added. It would be foolish to say that our knowledge of the cell is complete right now because we are still learning some things. But in this unit, we're going to learn about what we already know. So anyway, cell theory. Early studies led to the development of the cell theory. Let's talk about the discovery of cells. A guy named Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke, around the mid-1600s, he used a compound microscope to look at cork cells, just like a cork that may be in the end of a bottle. Cork is a type of like dead wood. And he actually gave the name cells to these little things that he was able to look at because it looked like individual rooms of monasteries or places that priests or monks lived. You can think about like jail cells, how there's a series of little tiny blocks if you were to look like down at a prison or a jail, and there's all these little rooms, one right after the other, very similar in size. That's what he saw. So he called them cells after the church rooms where the priests or the monks lived. Now, without the microscope, it would have been very difficult for him to see these things. And you'll kind of see as microscopes get better, more and more was understood about the cells because we could actually lay eyes on them, right? We could see what was going on. Robert Hooke, super important, gave the name cells. Anton van Leeuwenhoek, the W there is a V, Leeuwenhoek. A little bit after him in the later 1600s, he made a more powerful microscope lens, okay? So with this more powerful microscope, he was able to look at and describe living cells. Instead of the dead cork cells that Robert Hooke had seen, he actually looked at live ones and could see a little bit about what was going on in there. Now, of course, he wrote those things down, but he didn't have the internet to post it all to. So it actually became very popular among scientists around Europe, and a little bit further than that, to share these papers, to share these findings, these crude drawings that him and some of his contemporaries had made. So anyway, more was learned as microscopes were improved. So let's talk about how we get to the cell theory. We've got Hooke, we've got Leeuwenhoek. Now let's talk about a guy named Matthias Schleiden. Schleiden in the early 1800s, so we see about 150 years going through here. So it took a while for things to get a little better and people adding to the cell theory. And he proposed that all plants are actually just made of cells. Made of cells. So, we saw that Leeuwenhoek saw what was happening inside the living cell. But here Schleiden, he says plants are made of them. All plants are made of cells. Theodor Schwann, 1 year later, he talked to Schleiden. They were actually they shared a lot of research with each other. I wouldn't call them friends just because of some things that went on with them, but they were contemporaries. That's a good word for it. He concluded that all animals were also composed of cells. Now, up to this point, people didn't really know. We didn't think about what is making up all this other living things. What are these building blocks that we're all made out of? And these two guys started really thinking in that hey, all living things are made up of cells. Rudolf Virchow in 1855, so about 15 years after that or so, he said that all cells come from pre-existing cells. In other words, the carbohydrates and sugars and all that stuff in your body don't just mix together and boom, all of a sudden a cell is formed. He said, no, there's a method to this. They come from pre-existing cells. I think by now, hopefully you've watched a video on the weird history of the cell theory. And you will see that there is some debate about these three guys and some things that were going on and maybe some other people interested here. But the ideas is what I really want you to see about. Here we have all things are made of cells, both plants and animals, and also all cells come from pre-existing cells. They don't just magically appear, which some people did think at the time. All right, so all this accumulated research summarized as the cell theory, and it's one of the first unifying concepts that we can look at in the study of life or biology. There's three parts or three tenets to the cell theory. All right, and here's what they are. All organisms are made of cells. Okay, every living thing is made of cells. Right? All existing cells are produced by other living things, and that goes back to what Virchow he proposed. All existing cells are produced by other living things. We don't just magically have a cell pop up. We don't get a concoction of proteins and all these different carbohydrates and such, nucleic acids, and all of a sudden, ta-da, a cell is formed. No, they come very methodically through a process mainly called mitosis, as we'll learn about in, I think it's our next unit. But all existing cells are produced by other living cells. In this third one, it seems very elementary, I guess you could say, but it's the cell is the most basic unit of life. That yes, like even in this unit, we'll talk about organelles, the things that make up cells, but we don't count those as a unit of life because they can't exist on their own outside of the cell. The cell is as small as it gets. We have some single-celled organisms. That's those living things made up of one cell. But even within us, if we took it down to our smallest living part, or things that acts like kind of like we do, has some of the principles of life in it, it is the cell. So all organisms are made of cells. All existing cells are produced by other living things, or living cells, and the cell is the most basic unit of life. It don't get any smaller than that. Now, all cells do share a certain some certain characteristics. Now, let's think about what they are. Cells tend to be microscopic. They tend to be microscopic. Now, I like to preface that by saying some cells you can see with the naked eye. The human egg cell that forms in a female's ovaries, you can actually see it. Now, it's a very small speck, but you can lay eyes on it. Now, you can't see the inner workings of what's going on in that egg cell, but you can at least see it. Now, most cells tend to be microscopic in that we can't see them without use of microscopic lenses, right? I could swab the inside of my cheek and kind of look at like a toothpick if that's what I use to swab it, or a Q-tip, and I can't see those cells, right? But if I throw them under a microscope and maybe stain them a little bit just so it's easier to see them, man, I can really see what's going on in there. I can see the nucleus. I can see the outline of them, you know, much like we saw with Hooke, who saw these cork cells when he looked under a microscope. Before that, it was just kind of cork. Another characteristic is all cells are enclosed by a membrane. I mentioned that little shell. That's what we call it, the cell membrane. Now, later in this chapter, we'll talk about that some plants have something called a cell wall as well. But the cell is enclosed by a membrane that surrounds it. We're also going to see how that membrane works to allow things to pass in and out of a cell. And all cells are filled with cytoplasm. I like to think of cytoplasm as jelly. It's like a jelly-type substance where things float around in it. Think about like jelly. It's not really a solid, but it's not really a liquid, right? It's kind of a gel form. That's what cytoplasm's like. It's not a fluid, liquid type thing, but it's also not a solid. Things can move around in it. So those three things most cells share in common. Now there's two big categories of cells, okay, and they're very easy to differentiate. One is called prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells. Sorry, I was thinking of something else. Prokaryotic cells. These cells do not have what we call a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles. Basically, this is a great representation. They got a membrane, right? They got a membrane that surrounds it. Then they've got this cytoplasm jelly type stuff, and then there's just like other things mixed in here called nucleoids or whatever. A lot of times there's DNA just free floating inside of there. There's some ribosomes that we'll learn about later. But there's no like organelles trapped in it like we're about to see in the eukaryotic cell. There is no central located nucleus that the DNA is found in. All right. Prokaryotic cells typically are very primitive, and sometimes single-celled organisms are prokaryotic, and they're just very basic things that look similar to this, like certain types of bacteria. Okay. The second broad category is eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic. The EU makes that U sound. Eukaryotic cells. These as you probably guessed, have a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. So check out this picture. There's the nucleus. It's all wound up in here. We're going to learn that DNA is found inside there, consisting of chromatin, which is made of chromosomes. So there's a nucleus, and then there's these other membrane-bound organelles. That means they're not just free floating around in here. They are kind of their own little thing, right? Organelle means small organ, and it kind of looks like that. So you got things like a mitochondria that maybe you've heard about, or endoplasmic reticulum, lysosome. We're going to learn all about those, but they're membrane-bound. So eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, and they also have organelles that are membrane-bound. Prokaryotic, no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. All right, and that brings us to the end of this section. Please take these notes well. If you need to rewatch the video or slow it down or pause it, whatever, feel free to do that. And also go ahead and most likely take your quiz for this section.